Well, Kate, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. Yeah, it's been a little bit since you've been on. A lot
Yeah.
of life has happened. But yeah, thanks for making time. Your new book, which drops in about a month, is going to guide our discussion today. So can you tell our viewers and our listeners what that is?
Yeah. Thanks for having me again. I'm really glad to be here. I sort of got my start in youth ministry as a volunteer, and so it's really fun to be a part of this. Yeah. So my book is called An Untidy Faith, and and then journeying back to the joy of following Jesus, and it's really sort of a story of me getting sort of thrown into a lot of different cultural contexts in a short amount of time, in the span of a few years, and just kind of like as I did, and specifically Christian ones outside of the United States. So as that happened, um, I just sort of started recognizing that some of the things that I thought were like essentials in Christian faith or Christian practice or whatever, things that I fought really hard for, were actually more cultural things than, quote unquote, like Christian specific things. And
Mm-hmm.
so the book is really, and it sort of walks through some of those examples, whether it relates to theology specifically or church culture and practice and what that looks like. And, just how the people that I met overseas, intersected with my life and sharing some of their stories, and how it started me on a journey of untangling some of those things from my culture to have like more of a global faith that sort of can then translate into a bunch of different contexts, but left me with something that was much more like um joyful and peaceful and flexible, and has really shaped a lot of who I've become today.
Very cool. Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for sending me an advanced copy. It's been fun to read some of that, and we'll be promoting it on the way there for the next month. But yeah, so this episode, from the title, obviously, we're talking about helping teenagers joyfully practice their faith. And last week, we talked with Brad Griffin from Fuller Youth Institute about helping teenagers find their purpose. And I think this fits nicely with that. In your upcoming book, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you present the best way to understand our purpose as followers of Jesus and how to practice our faith in Jesus is kind of hold those together. I'm talking about in your book, you have an apt description of orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and orthopathy. So, Kate, could you tell us why it's important for youth workers to realize this themselves as they're helping guide students with the more holistic perspective of living and practicing their faith?
Yeah, I think the challenge, and maybe I'll like orthodoxy, right, is right belief is sort of
Mm-hmm.
the bucket we have for that. Orthopraxy, right, is right doing, right practice. And then I didn't make up the word, but I sort of like reappropriated it for my
Mm-hmm.
own purposes. Orthopathy, which is more like right being, right becoming. And that sort of for me is like the maturity element, right? Like you can be taught quote unquote the right things, and you can even engage in the right practices. But if we look at the things that Jesus prioritizes, or even, some of the rest of the New Testament, and even throughout the Bible, there's an emphasis on like why you do something and how you do something being just as important, right, as what you're doing or what you're believing. And I think that's sort of like the missing piece in a lot of discipleship practice today, is that we sort of forget that we're also shaping like good human beings along the way. Like if that's not the result of our orthodoxy and orthopraxy, then there's something missing in the whole process. And so I sort of use the fruit of the spirit as the guide for like what orthopathy is, right? It's love, it's joy, it's peace, it's patience, it's all these ways that love shows up in our lives. And so that means that it's often like formed through like conflict or just
Mm.
like engaging in human relationships. and navigating those. And that means that we have to be aware of our humanness, and we have to be like equipped to deal with some of those things. Like, how do we have conversations when we disagree, and how do we even understand that something we're feeling is, you know, quote unquote, is because we're like triggered, right? Or because
Yeah.
we're in this, or because we're tied up in this thing or that thing. And so there's this sort of like element, I think, that we have a lot of, at least in the traditions I grew up with, there was a lot of like separation between like physical and spiritual, and then like mental was like not really, you just like,
Yeah.
I don't know, God will handle it, it'll be fine, you know. But it
Yep.
needs to sort of be brought in, because that's part of, if the goal of the Christian life is wholeness, and I believe it is at the end, that is what the world will be, that is what we will be. We will be whole, and we will be in the presence of God fully. And I think that is what we need to focus on now. And so in our discipleship, I think those relationships and those like equipping, you know, teenagers and, you know, adults even, to understand what's happening in their minds, and like the feelings that they're having emotionally, and how that sort of can be shaped or used, or be information for what they do. And, you know, helping them to grasp, you know, what good motivation is, or what people, I guess that's sort of the wrong word, because I don't want to like shame people into like, you did this wrong, but it's,
Yeah.
but I think there is something to like getting them caught up in the vision of what the church is and what it means to follow Jesus, so that the becoming lives into that, instead of it just being a matter of checking boxes.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I love how you appropriated that word. And a lot of what your description was leading up to that in other parts of the book, and then around that description, reminded me. He wasn't one of my professors, but he was a professor at Grand Canyon University for a long time. And then he ended up being a pastor for a few years at my home church. And he talked about the idea of spiritual maturity. And just as you talked about, so you have the truth, right? You have the content, doctrine, you have actions. But if you're not mature in all these other areas of life, you're not spiritually mature, because it should be a straight line across. It's not like, well, I have all this doctrine and I'm able to check all these boxes off of doing these right practices, so I'm spiritually mature. And there's a lot of people who have been following Jesus for a long time, who are deacons, elders, like that go-to volunteer in that church, who are all over the place, and that's great, and the kingdom needs them. But I've also met people who are in those positions, who, when they're asked to step up, maybe into a different position, or asked to come forward to be part of a group that gives like central input to the vision of the church, they it's cool moment to have them realize like their own lack of humility and lack of preparedness for that moment, or like, you know, I know all these things, but when it comes to other areas of my life, or how this is going to affect that, I don't know if I'm that person to be talking to. Or people who are nominated and brought on to be a deacon or an elder and don't know what it means to be a deacon or be an elder. They're just that
Yeah.
guy who's been around. And so I think it's great for us to look at the holistic perspective that you bring up. And just as you mentioned in the book about education, which is almost exactly what that professor also said, of the more educated I get, the more I'm aware of how much I'll never know. And
Oh yeah.
I think we need to take that, which I think you argue for well. I think we need to take that approach with our discipleship and our spiritual growth, because the moment that someone who's been a believer for X amount of years doesn't think they can learn anything from a teenager in a small group, or from someone of a different generation, um, you know, that person has stopped growing. And I think to walk into a room where you're actively thinking, I'm not the smartest person here, I have something to learn from everyone here, and to believe that, not just have it be an empty mantra. I think
Mhm.
that's a good approach for teenagers to take, for youth leaders to take, as far as starting to grasp in their week in, week out ministry with teenagers, or just being part of the church, what you're talking about here, in your book. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think it is important. I think humility is probably one of the most underrated traits um in the world, but especially in the church.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that you can't be confident, right? I think there's a difference between, confidence and arrogance,
Hmm.
and we've maybe become less adept at figuring out what that is, like finding, like treading that line and picking people or seeing people. But again, I think that's why community exists, right? And that's why we need to give ourselves and everyone in the room permission, at no matter where they are, to be able to speak into situations or speak up about people or whatever, because it's only by having everyone together and a variety of experiences in the room, and feeling confident enough to share their voice, that we get, the whole picture of a person, but also the whole picture of like whatever we're doing in scripture. I think it requires all of us. And so we need to continue to value all those different sort of experiences and perspectives, in our approach to teaching, or even, managing church ministries, because I think that's going to be, yeah, the way forward is going to be, you know, connecting to a whole bunch of other people and experiences, because I think that's how we sort of figure out, that there is more to learn. But if we're always in this sort of like, we only ever hear from the same kind of people,
Hmm.
you're going to sort of start feeling like, well, I've already heard this, I've already done that. But if it's looked at from a different angle by a different person, that's when it breaks open again for you, and that's what makes it real and, special and exciting and joyful again. And so I think we need to lean into that, because I think we need that more than ever.
Yeah. Totally agree. So you used the word in your book, and I used it in the title of this episode. So I think it's good for us to qualify that adjective joyfully. You also mentioned just a second ago how to engage each other well. I got to interview Daryl Bach with his cultural intelligence, yeah, cultural intelligence book that dropped on election day 2020. I did that on purpose. But he used a word that he borrowed from the music world, triphonic. And since you have three orthos in your book, to use a Daryl Bach word, your triphonic description of discipleship, um, as far as a practical sense of how to start engaging that, the first thing you list is a sense of belonging. And that's a perpetual thing for teenagers to want to find as they're answering, who am I? And I definitely found youth ministry as my sense of belonging in the place where I best saw the lived out narrative of the church more than any other point in my life, especially at that time. Um, so how can youth workers help students find a faithful rhythm of serving joyfully, while a lot of them are even in the process of finding a place to belong? Because even students who come week in and week out, they might not feel yet, or maybe at all, depending on the depth of it, if youth ministry is their place where they belong. So how do you think youth workers can help students like hold those together? Because that's probably not complete yet.
Yeah. So I think helping people at first like feel like they belong. I think we sort of have this idea that it means that everything is just right and we get along with everyone, and we know we all agree, or we all have the same interests and all that
Right.
stuff. But I think it
Mm-hmm.
really starts with this idea that no matter who you are loved here, you're cared for here, you're supported here, you're believed here, you're seen here. I think it has to sort of start from that place, just like a radical commitment to like see and be with people. Like even if it's not a lot of talking, just like proximal, but proximal presence, and like continuing to like, check in or just be around or recognize, something in someone. So I think a lot of it just like starts with an attitude of like ready to love, and then also just paying attention, right? I
Mm.
think there's so much paying attention that we can do for each other, and then it's really easy to know like, oh, then this person needs this, or they said this, which means I can help them in this way, or I can introduce them to this person. And so I think it just sort of starts with, being committed to love, paying attention to what they're saying, doing, and what they need, but also giving them like permission to be who they are, and live that out. I think there's always ideas of like what the perfect whatever fill in the blank is, whether that
Mm-hmm.
is, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, worker, youth person, like whatever it is, there is like an assumed ideal of what that is. And so I think you can be intentional as youth ministry to have a variety of people in leadership, that's so that there is again a variety of experience and background and perspective and interest, so that people are like, oh, they're weird too, I can be weird here, it's safe to be weird here,
Mm,
it's celebrated here, right?
yeah.
And so I think that's really just like how we cultivate an atmosphere of belonging, is just like letting people be weird and celebrating it, right? And so I think that's really, yeah, how that starts. And it just sort of like, it's okay for it to be in the middle and in process, because we're all sort of, I think it's also okay to walk into a room and wonder, is it safe for me to be here? Can I be my whole self here? And so the commitment from the ministry end is to make that a place that is safe for people to be there. And so and then I think you can just sort of like create rhythms in which people can be proximal to other people, and those different perspectives, even if they don't like fully participate, right? I think just kind of like rubbing shoulders with people, being in the same space as people, hearing from a variety of people, um, again, gives that permission that they need, to figure out where they may fit. And so I think if you're celebrating all the different kinds of people that are there, people will feel more like like they can belong. And I think when they feel they belong, even the littlest thing becomes joyful. And so it can be a regular check-in every day or every week or whatever. Um, but I think what part of what makes it joyful is not just our relationship to God in the practice, but our relationship to others in the practice.
Mm,
And
mm-hmm.
so feeling like you can be yourself in those spaces is probably, I these days I would put that as like top of my list for like what makes a good ministry environment, is just feeling like everyone can be themselves and do so respectfully and with tools, and like, there's still lots of conversation and like, things that we have to work out as human beings, like all those orthopathy things, right? Um but I think when people feel that, a lot of the guard comes down and it lets them feel like they belong, and they bond a little bit more quickly. And it makes whatever practice they do, even if it's picking up garbage on the side of the road, if it's with people that they enjoy doing that with, then they're going to enjoy the practice just as much, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think every healthy youth ministry would be just as you described, a place where everyone can be weird and celebrate it. Because there's a lot of weirdness
Yeah.
that comes in with teenagers anyway. And I don't think it's I don't think it's more true post COVID. It's probably just in the last 10 years or so. But with social media and connectedness and how trends are like, if a trend is more than a week old, it's like, wow, this has staying power. Where before trends were like
Yeah.
seasonal or yearly, like the biggest thing that happened on YouTube one time was the guy who said, hide your kids, hide your wife, like there's things that move so quickly now. And youth
Mm-hmm.
workers probably feel like, well, if I don't know all the TikTok dances, if I don't know this and who's saying what and did that, then the students are going to find me irrelevant and not helpful. And I've shared on many episodes before and even talking with people, but um, by far the best youth workers I've seen don't give a rip about being cool. They're the ones who are present and consistent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the best example I've ever seen of that is a youth worker who was close to 80 years old. He was the seventh grade boys leader at summer camp. And I was a speaker. It was my home church, but I came in when I was in seminary to help run some seminars and do some stuff. And it was 10 o'clock at night, and there was a camp talent show, and he was letting the boys like put his hair all up and like with shaving cream and green dye and stuff. And I'm like, they don't care anything about his knowledge of pop culture or whatever. They care that he's here engaging with them, and that's what it's all about. And so the ability to have that comfort for leaders, and if they mimic that and show that, then students hopefully will feel like, okay, it is a safe place for me to be myself, or at least hopefully think this could be a safe place. Not come in, see everything going on, get wide eyed, sit in the corner and wait for mom or dad to come pick him up. It's especially with just all of the expressions of identity today, and how a lot of them are hot button and polarizing. And well, if you come in here, you have to dress this way and do this. And I understand there's a lot of important things with that, but also the more I talk with people who are really up to date and trying to stay in youth ministry, they're like, we need to place a lot of things to the side and just make sure, first of all, can people just come in our building? Because they need to be able to do that. And yeah, I think having a place that's everyone's weird and celebrated and seen, is a good start, for every youth ministry.
Yeah, I mean, I think on that, like, love is always relevant, right? Like, it doesn't matter what else is going on or how much you know about everything. Like, you can connect with people over the humanness and the hard things that you've been through and like all of these different things. You don't have to connect them on like this like top level interest level, right?
Yeah,
And so I
yeah.
think allowing that to be available, and if they know that it's a place where they can walk in and be loved, then, and all of those other things are going to be side issues, if not an issue at all, depending on the churches that you're in, then I think that's important. But like you said, if we make those things the top level thing, you're never ever going to be able to have relationships with certain, and not just like those kids, right, who have those identities, but in their humanness, but even their friends who are standing up for them or hanging out with them. Like, there's a lot of, yeah, I mean, without that honoring of their humanness, and regardless of what you think of the identity, remembering that humanness and letting them exist as they are. Like, if you can't just let them exist, then there's never going to be an opportunity for any other kind of thing. And they probably need that love more than a lot of other people do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I think so. Um, yeah. So we've kind of mentioned it here a little bit, and so getting specific now, with I think the closest we can grasp that completeness feel of shalom this side of Jesus coming back, is what you've been talking about this whole time. Faithfully and fully living out our best human qualities as followers of Jesus, and to qualify it just like that. And which I also grew up, lumping our humanness in with the perpetual battle of flesh versus faith. And sure, there is truth to that, but I think we generalize it and polarize it, which kind of seems to be the mode of how you do everything today. And so, Kay, what's a word of advice you would give youth workers who trying to help students think about themselves in a more holistic light of, yes, creation's broken, yes, there's sin, but when God made us, he said we were very good, and the incarnation proves that we have eternal worth. And so, yeah, what would you tell youth workers who are trying to counsel students to live out their best human selves, not just separate all that and just be faithful?
Yeah, I think that's so good, and I love that you bring up the incarnation there, because I think there is this idea that like flesh, because of the terms used in the English version of the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
that it is
Mm-hmm.
inherently sinful,
Yeah.
when it's not, right? Like, if that was the case, then Jesus could not have been who Jesus is. And so there is sort of this rewriting of that script that we need to do. And then, yeah, understanding that like it is, I think the journey to wholeness is a journey of like reintegration, right? Of
Mm.
all these things, I think sin broke a lot of those connections and has sort of like turned them into different sort of, I here's an example. So like, one of my friends is a therapist, and she's like, did you know that excitement and nervousness are biologically the same feeling, right? But it's the story that you have around it that your brain will say is this or that thing, right?
Yeah.
And so if um so it's like, even being nervous like could be excitement or it could be nervousness, and those are all fine, but we sort of like have a bad on one side and a good on another when really they're the same thing. And so how do we then sort of like push these into like reintegrate ourselves and have this like idea of like our feelings as information, right? Or our bodies as like when they're in pain as like information that we need to do, or that even emotional things affect our bodies in ways that we didn't know until more recently. So it's sort of this like, in order to be whole spiritual beings living in physical bodies, and I wouldn't even characterize it that way because that makes it sound like they're separate and they're actually together, is to sort of take all of this together. And so I think it's a matter of just like reminding ourselves that all of these things that have been sort of vilified they're not bad. They're part of our experience. They're part of Jesus's experience, and that our journey isn't a separation of them fully. It's the full reintegration of them in wholeness, in goodness, in holiness. And so to treat them as such, like how do we, if we care for our spirit, we should care for our body and we should care for our minds. And that even just like we get nudges from Holy Spirit about something, we get nudges in our body and nudges in our feelings, and how do we use those as information that isn't separate from our spiritual life, but is part of our spiritual life. And, so the things that we do in our body are spiritual, just the same way that the things that we think can be spiritual, and the things that we spiritualize are spiritual. And so I think we just have to start erasing some of these lines, and work toward using them for our full growth, and health on every level, instead of just doing one in spiritual and then like ignoring everything else. So I think we just have to rewrite a lot of the stories and keep reminding ourselves of the value of each part of it toward, if you do want to put a focus on the spiritual things, toward the spiritual, rather than seeing it as a hindrance or something separate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's un it's untraining our attempt to compartmentalize in order for us to be more faithful. It's had to shatter that
Yeah.
we have to be more faithful to how God made us in his image and live that out fully, right? And not being afraid to embrace things about ourselves that have been affected by sin, and being able to like be accountable in that and yet not apologize for trying to live that out. Because living together, right, that limited but this side of Jesus coming back, like probably the most practical approach to shalom and being complete and seeking the fullness of the kingdom yet to come. Yeah, that's probably the best way for leaders to teach students, and then for all of them to model that for them as well. And I know, being in the local church, at least, a lot of that is dictated by the approach and the doctrine of the church. But yeah, so it's not a, well, here it is, cut and paste. It's part of a process, but I think it starts with having the right perspective. And
Yeah.
I think what you laid out here is a template for that people can sub in. Okay, here's where I go to church. Here's whatever. But I think the actual approach is a template that can be used, not just a one size cram it all in. So
Yeah, and I think that even goes to like the work that the church does on the outside, right? That like
yes,
taking care of
yes,
people's physical presence is
hmm,
a spiritual work. And so
yeah,
I think it's not just doing it for ourselves, but again, modeling it outside to other
hmm,
people and saying every part of you is valued here, not just your soul. And making that sort of like your living practice too.
hmm, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Kate, thanks again for hopping on the podcast. I'll definitely be promoting your book that drops in a month. Congrats. That's awesome. And
Thank you.
yeah, I'll drop links to contact info for you if people want to get in touch with you or see more about your book in the show notes and the YouTube description. Thanks again for hopping on. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, that does it for today's podcast episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to this YouTube channel so you can have a heads up about when we have new content. Also, if you ever listen to podcasts in the car or somewhere else, please follow us on your podcast player of choice. We are on every single one of them. If you haven't already, please check out our website, youthministrymaverick.com. There you can see a comprehensive list of our guests, their bio information, a list of ministries that can help you in your own ministry, some articles I've written, and a store where you can get some podcast merchandise. Also, we have a big ask. If you would go and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, not just a rating, but a review, take a screenshot of it and send it to me on social media. And in return, I will write you a thank you card and send you some podcast merchandise that you can't buy on the store. Well, that does it. We'll catch you next time. Adios.